Well, we know what time it is. Since it's April 15th again, I'm making this video for the 112th anniversary of the Titanic disaster. However, I decided to do something a bit different this time. I am currently taking a class in college called vector statics, which is to calculate and measure forces on objects in order to balance all of them to zero when added and subtracted. Basically a very important part of mechanical engineering, my current major. So since I wasn't doing so well in the class, I decided that making videos like this may allow me to be able to study the subject a bit better. This time, I will be explaining the physics involved in sinking what was once an unsinkable ship that sank 112 years ago on its maiden voyage.
We all know about the Titanic, the four-funneled ocean liner that sank in the Atlantic Ocean on April 15, 1912 in the middle of the night by hitting an iceberg, 112 years before this video was posted at the exact same date. Thanks to the inadequate number of lifeboats, the number of people sleeping at that time, and the crew's handling of the situation, 1,500 people died that night. As the ship descended 12,000 feet underwater, we know many interesting details that happened. The ship's bow being pulled down, the funnels collapsing, and of course the ship splitting once it reached a high enough angle. But why did this happen? Well, after looking at various videos on YouTube and doing research about physics for my classes and free time, I'll put it this way. The Titanic's total mass was 52,310 long tons, which is about 50 million kilograms, and its gross register tonnage was 46,329 GRT, which can be converted to about 1.3105 cubic meters. This meant its density would be 381.5 kilograms per cubic meter. Normally, water's density is 997 kilograms per cubic meter. This obviously lets the ship float. Of course, boilers, engines, and internal fittings would add more mass to the ship, but overall, it still had more than enough density to float on its own, and as many of us know, let in 4 bulkheads of water and still remain under 997. Unfortunately, the amount that entered that night was too much for the ship to handle. When Titanic hit the iceberg, it slowly scratched parts of the hull, resulting in the 5 compartments flooding up. Now, we know 4 flooded compartments could still allow the ship to have enough density to float, but 5 was too much, which obviously would exceed 997 kilograms per cubic meter. And even if it stayed without flowing over the unsealed bulkheads, the ship now had way too much added mass to stay afloat, thanks to all the weight the water was adding in. But however, for the first 2 hours, the ship remained mostly afloat, slowly filling up with more and more water, thus rapidly adding mass to the ship's interior at an increasing rate. Every drop of water that entered would add more mass, overcoming the reaction buoyancy forces against the hull and increase as more water entered. The flooding was about 7 long tons second. 1 long ton is about 1,000 kilograms, meaning that about 7,000 kilograms of water going inside the ship every second once the iceberg had torn it. In this case, the total mass at an amount of time could be measured by m equals 53,149,052. 4 plus 1,000s. Every second, the mass increased, allowing the density to increase, which eventually surpassed 997. After about 2 hours of constant flooding, the unbalanced weight from the bow would pull the ship downwards at an angle, as the still buoyant areas kept the ship up temporarily as a pivot point. Before long, the propellers began to rise, and the bridge would touch the water. Once the bridge was completely submerged, the water reached the first funnel, causing it to collapse. After hours of being filled, the water had covered the bridge. It then surrounded the first funnel. Around that time, it would collapse upon contact. But why? The reason why the funnels collapsed when submerged was because they were not made to sustain large forces and remain upright. They had been weakly welded to the top of the ship, depending on the cables to keep them upright while sailing. Because funnels are hollow, the water pressure surrounding the base was greater than the ones the funnel exerted to the fluid. This would crush the base and disconnect it, causing it to lean over. Some of the cable were pulled more than they were designed to. The vessel's rising angle and the disconnection from the base resulted in it being in a position where some cables were unable to hold it up anymore. As a result, the first funnel then collapsed. However, some interior problems that caused an explosion in the boilers caused the second funnel to collapse. Basically, the boilers have steam exerting 215 pounds per square inch inside them. The steam would flow into pipes where they made their way to the engines. When water entered, this caused the it to boil, resulting in even more steam. which resulted in even more pressure expanding in the boilers. When the sigh had reached over the max pressure that the boilers could survive, they exploded. The explosion then blew the second funnel off its base.
Shortly after the two funnels had collapsed, the water in the bow had added even more mass in the front compartments that it began to be pulled to a higher and higher angle. The torque caused from the first few compartments would be more than enough to theoretically pull it upright. Of course, the metal used to make the hull was unable to act against the weight pulling on the stern after a higher angle was reached. One misconception was that it broke at a high angle, especially thanks to that scene in 1997, but thanks to durability tests, they proved that this would be physically impossible. It probably wasn't even able to survive over 23 degrees. The gravity pulling on the ship's stern combined with forces exerted by the heavy engines and boilers in there as well would tear the ship in half. Titanic's stern was filled with some of the 29 heavy boilers weighing 91.5 tons each plus a 720-ton engine. Because the torque applied to the stern by gravity and the contents mass, we all know what happened. It split. The split happened around the third funnel, which would have been on top of what was the pivot keeping the ship at an angle. The water caused the stern to touch the surface. It immediately stopped it, causing many objects, especially passengers and the fourth funnel, to fall over. But the double bottom of the hull was not fully disconnected, meaning that the bow was still barely attached as it split. However, keep in mind that the hull is made of metal. The split was not like sawing a steel bar in half, but basically bending and twisting it around until it snapped. Because of how it deforms, many molecules will be bent out of place, which is why you can easily reconnect ductile objects that have snapped like this. In terms of the hull, the metal had been warped around during the tear, which had opened a few more compartments around the stern. As water started entering, it bent the double bottom until the bow fully split off, similar to breaking a popsicle stick in half and folding it the opposite direction afterwards. Now the stern began to be pulled to a 90-degree angle. The bulkhead covering the gap was not enough to keep water from entering the gaping hole since the hull had been warped to open some compartments. And the fact that the heavy boilers and engines were now hanging out of them did nothing but help make the situation even worse.
Without the bow attached to keep the stern and its heavy interior parts buoyant and upright, it would be pulled up to a 90-degree angle shortly before finishing its final plunge. Because the bow had about 2 hours to completely fill up with water, the pressure between the interior and exterior of the ship was almost balanced. This is why it still regained its well-preserved 3D shape once it landed. As it descended underwater, the streamlined design and shape of the ship, particularly the prow, caused it to move forward at a 20-degree angle as it accelerated towards the ocean floor, probably at 35 miles per hour. Thanks to water resistance, it presumably pushed the mast onto the bridge, and a few small fittings were probably torn off as well. Since the ship maintained its 20-degree angle because of the reaction force caused by the water, it would land at that angle. The reaction force from the seabed went against the ship and pushed against the inertia of the ship's middle section, resulting in the hull buckling, which explains the large gaps and warped steel in the middle of this section, plus why the prow section is buried deep in the mud. The impact would also, thanks to the filled water and the reaction force the floor exerted on the ship, knock off even more parts, especially a cargo hatch cover. However, thanks to the balanced pressure and design, most of the damage was sustained upon impact, keeping it preserved well. At least with exception of the bacteria eating it shortly after the descent and still being responsible for its deterioration today. The stern, however, did not have a fall as graceful as the bows. Because it was mostly depending on the unbalanced weight caused by the said engines, as well as the flooded forward compartments, to descend, it still had many unflooded interior rooms, also known as air pockets. As a result, the increasing pressure underwater would exert forces on it, with magnitudes of about 6,000 pounds per square inch. The hull could not resist the forces acting around it, which caused the stern to be crushed. The implosion caused the upper decks to peel off and fold around each other. The rudder, which was knocked into a small angle during the fall, also caused the ship to spin roughly because of how the water was acting on it, shaking even more pieces off and increased the damage until it finally landed. With the decks folded on top of each other and a huge debris field around it, the stern now looks like a mashed lasagna with 1/4 of a potato sticking out of one end, while the bow looks like a half-eaten slice of cake with only the crust cut off. And thanks to the spinning descent, that's why the ends of the bow and stern point in the different directions, and why the stern looks this poor today. Physics applies to everything that happens daily, from falling objects to sitting down. And it, as well as Mother Nature, are not very merciful. They don't make choices on which things should be affected, and will behave the same way on everything regardless of what it is and how it was made. Despite how beautiful the Titanic was, its beauty and popularity would not keep it preserved, at least not forever. As we are watching this video, bacteria is eating the metal on both ends of the Titanic wreck. And the 112 years left underwater to corrode combined with natural forces and waves have only helped deteriorate it even faster. Because of the condition when it was found combined with the depths of the sea, raising or saving the wreck is virtually impossible. Nothing, of course, is meant to last forever. And as long as the wreck is still upright, we should cherish its history and photos. And even years after it finishes deteriorating, we should continue sharing this tragedy to generations coming after we are gone.